actually implement into the clinic? And so this question is particularly for Dr. Sawyers and for Dr. Schmitz. And so when you think about having patients involved in clinical trials, how do you go about selecting those patients? Who actually gets to be a part of this? And how do you think about making sure you're including a representative and wide group of patients in those clinical trials?
Would you like me to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's a terrific question. From my own personal experience, I've been involved in clinical trials in which it's a precision medicine strategy. So patients are screened for, their tumors are screened to see if they're eligible based on the genomic alteration that's being tested in the trial. That by itself already introduces a bias that I think you're getting at, which is not all patients are having their tumors sequenced. So the ability to have them be considered for the, because of this molecular criterion is limited to those who have access to that technology. It generally, the expense of tumor sequencing is covered. It means that you can screen several hundred patients to enroll a handful if it's a rare mutation. That was the case when I was starting these trials, but the technology of tumor sequencing is more. I think we have a serious conversation to have about the of having that technology available across other. I would say that in the earliest stages of a clinical trial, they tend to be done in cancer at what are called comprehensive cancer centers. We talked about the National Cancer Institute and these different designations yesterday. So these tend to be in large cities and represent a certain mix of population of patients. But I think as we heard yesterday, 85% of patients are not at these cancer centers. They represent, the vast majority of cancer patients. And it's very important to make these trials available outside of this sort of what I'll call elite, set of, and that generally happens in the later stages of a clinical trial after the safety has been at least tested at an initial level. But I'd love to hear from others how to make this better. So
this is Kate. I'll speak up next and just state that I think that Dr. Sawyers and I, sit at kind of the opposite ends of a spectrum of precision oncology versus health-oriented interventions. And so the way that you're going to choose someone for a trial that's a precision oncology trial where someone has to have a genetic mutation to be eligible for a trial is obviously going to be quite different than how I'm going to try to identify people for a trial that is attempting to how we can change health services to make exercise standard of care within medical, so which is seeking to try to get every possible patient at a cancer center involved in the program. So, but I think that the thing that is in common, an important thing that I think is in common across this entire spectrum, is that the inclusion and exclusion criteria fit the science. And so, of course, it makes absolute sense. And so I want to make sure that I'm not criticizing, Dr. Sawyer's work and being very precise. He needs to be in order to answer his scientific question. And meanwhile, my research requires that I have a much more wide open inclusion-exclusion criteria. So that's an important thing for your audience to understand that inclusion criteria will vary with regard to how strict they are according to the type of research that we're talking about, and how far along in the trajectory that initial discovery to dissemination.
Does anyone else have anything they would like to add to the sort of thoughts about who gets in clinical trials? Dr. Hughes Halbert.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I would just add that I think inclusion and exclusion criteria are critically important for all of the reasons that have been described and discussed. I do think one of the potential risks of having an exclusion criteria that for someone with diabetes or hypertension from participating in therapeutic trials in particular is those are the diseases that are more common in racial and ethnic minorities. And so, the subsequent effects are that those populations may be included in the trials which are for understanding the therapeutic mechanisms, biological mechanisms that lead to therapeutic effects. There's been an interest in understanding ways in which inclusion and exclusion criteria can be appropriate to ensure safety, but also not prohibitive to include the populations and the cancer patients that might also be important to think about in terms of the clinical benefits. And if they're excluded because they have a comorbidity, most cancers do have a comorbidity. So they have a risk of enrolling the healthiest cancer patients on the trials.
Yeah, Dr. Chambers.
Excellent points being made, and just to build on, we do tend in trials to look for homogeneity in our samples to reduce unwanted sources of error and variance so that we can maximise our chances of getting a result. But the outcome of that often, though, is that we do exclude people, and we are taking our research away from what a real world context might look like, so that we end up with results that, and I'm talking about behavioural science research, made in the behavioural science lab, but don't work at all when you get them out into the real world. So I think there is some pragmatic trial designs that take that into account. The other point I would make is that what we often also do is we automatically exclude people on the basis of our perceptions that they are too vulnerable to be part of our studies. That can become a source of bias as well. And so in the research in the area of law, in the discipline of law, there's quite this idea of talking about that as being inappropriate. Everybody is vulnerable, so this concept of universal vulnerability, and to really question some of the rules in trial design as to whether they really serve us in the pursuit of knowledge that's really going to make a change where we need it, which is in our community.
Anyone else? Okay, then we'll move on to the next question. So one of the themes that comes up is this idea of implementation and taking practices that are occurring in these sort of National Institute of Health designated cancer centers and things like that, and applying it in all of the different places. And so one of the key things that might come in that aspect would be sort of education of healthcare professionals. And so I was wondering how you take an existing system that has people that went to medical school 1 year ago, as well as people that went to medical school 40 years ago, together with all of the other healthcare professionals that are so central to a patient's care, and really think about how do you layer in this education for everyone. And so when we think about this education, it could be everything from exercise to psycho-oncology to how to best use artificial intelligence. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on how do we actually take this and educate people on how they might actually be able to use it. Start with Al-Lazikani thinking about the sort of how do we actually have machine learning go into the clinic from an education perspective, but also I would very much be interested in hearing from Dr. Chambers and Dr. Schmitz about some of the other sort of components of taking care of the whole patient, as well as potentially Dr. June and Dr. Sawyers coming from the physician perspective. So I realize that's a lot. So let's start with Dr. Al-Lazikani.
So I think one of the key things is to actually fit in the sort of the works that the individuals are already working in. In the UK, and I'm sure it's no different in the US, you know, our doctors and nurses are flat out all the time. They're exhausted. They have to comply with a whole bunch of processes and systems. If you're trying to get them to sort of take time out and really change their processes and the way they're thinking straight away, that's going to become difficult. So I think a key part of this education is to fit into their natural workflows, to identify ways to bring, for example, if you bring in a new tool, a new app, a new something that's going to help them in the clinic, to actually figure out ways to use it gradually and in a way that does not interfere with their daily activities, and also identify what are the key benefits they will get, rather than think, well, if you spend this year training really hard when you're exhausted, in a year's time it's going to be brilliant. Actually break it down into small benefits that you can achieve as part of their natural workflow.
How about Dr. Schmitz?
So I would just say that in all of my experience, education often in clinical settings doesn't change much at all. We know in the development of clinical practice guidelines and attempts at implementing them, they're rarely implemented. The cases where I've seen practice really change have actually been where we've got consumer versions, practice guidelines, given them to the consumers, and they've driven change from a consumer demand point of view. Really have changed practice. You have to take a systems and a multi-leveled approach, and that's why we've got this valley of death where nothing ever that we busily keep churning out information hoping that change will just happen. So that's just a general comment, and that requires design thinking, co-production ideas that we're all very well. I think the other problem, though, is currency of data. Things are changing so incredibly rapidly, with new trial data coming out constantly, suggesting to us news of improving treatments. And you can put a whole lot of effort into a clinical guideline, for example, and it's out of date 2 years in breakthroughs. So there are multiple changes we have ahead of us with the rapid pace of new knowledge emerging, resource constraints about what we can actually do, and systems that are very bedded down in the way they do things and are generally, healthcare systems are generally resistant to change propose.
Yeah, Dr. Schmitz.
So I was really impressed in listening to all of my colleagues' talks at the theme of implementation. Actually, that was really struck me that, you know, we needed a new way to produce new medicines. We need a new way to innovate the cycle of creating CAR T, therapy. We need a better way of connecting people with exercise and psycho-oncology interventions. So I think that in implementation is a theme across the entire conference in the past several days, and I think that the way the innovation would work likely is quite different according to what it is that we're innovating on, what it is that we're implementing. So one of the ways that I tried to innovate and implement with an exercise intervention trial at Penn State was to cut out the clinicians entirely because they're so busy. So I really first had to say about, take it straight to the patient. So I think that there are some places where we can do some of that. I think there are other places where there are therapies that people in more rural settings and, the 85% of cancer centers are not National Cancer Institute designated. they're hungry to get CAR T therapy. I'm very proud at Penn State when we put our first patient on CAR T. People in these locations aren't aware of these new therapies. How we implement those, I think that it comes down to the value proposition and understanding who it is a value proposition for. I think that the entire system has a value proposition for trying to get CAR T therapy. I think we have a much more difficult time selling size for every patient to the health system. And so the places where we will target our attempts to implement broadly are going to vary according to what it is that we're trying to implement.
Dr. Sawyers, yeah.
So these are great points. I wanted to ask the question is how do doctors who aren't in medical school anymore, how do they keep abreast of current knowledge? There's a long-standing practice of continuing medical education, and then when a new drug is approved, there are to include that in the curriculum, the word out. But there's an undertone that everyone should be aware of, and that is the pharmaceutical companies that are manufacturing this new drug have huge marketing budgets, and they can reach out to customers by directly talking to physicians and encouraging the use of the drug. That's under incredible legal scrutiny now. But they also, as you know from just watching television, they have direct-to-consumer advertising. And so there's there's just a double-edged sword about getting the word out from sort of trustworthy sources versus perhaps others who might, sort of make the grass a little greener than it might quite be. Although you as you know from watching all the side effects being discussed in a 3-second long but I do want to go back to the role of the consumer that Suzanne and Kathryn both brought up. When we first started, it was really about educating the physicians to then educate their patients. But it is absolutely the case that patients come into the physician's office today having done very extensive internet searches and talking to other patients through disease health groups and are highly educated. So I feel like it's going in the right direction by having both parties at the table to make the right decisions.
Doctor, have anything to add from the sort of physician perspective?
So I'll say, one thing that I don't think has been brought up, now that, what Charles presented and Jim and my group, we have much, if you will, sharper tools to test. So when I first started medical school, we were doing trials with drugs that wouldn't work, and there were thousands of people on breast cancer trials and so on. And looking, because we're looking with had much more potent therapies, we can use many smaller numbers of patients. The powering to see efficacy is less, and also the ability to go and biopsy tumors. So a patient on the interventional trials, if patients have biopsies and they have tumor sequence, we can know in much fewer numbers of patients now if it's actually hitting the target and working. And so that's really changing our science. And I think so that's a major change now. We hopefully can be testing things on fewer numbers of patients and throw them away if they don't work sooner, rather than these trials that we used to do several decades ago and even just 10 years ago.
So the next question is really about the artificial intelligence and sort of this data sets. And so the idea of the data set only being as good as input. And so thinking about the data set itself being potentially biased, and then when we think about going into the artificial intelligence and machine learning, there's also that of the outcome only being as good as what goes in. And so I wanted to start with the idea of genomics and thinking about sort of the history of the fact that genetic information has been misused in so many different populations, and going back to even the history of eugenics, that there are a lot of populations that are very resistant to having genetic information available. And so how do you take that history that does exist and think about that when you make your genomic data sets in Project Genie or in the artificial intelligence sort of libraries that would go to identify druggable targets and things like that. And so I thought that maybe we could start with either Dr. Hughes or Dr. Bissan Al-Lazikani, and then maybe Dr. Thomas could also weigh in a little bit about the sort of data set element. How do you go about getting a quality data set about, and then open it up to the rest of the panel.
So I'll start. So data bias is actually incredibly important, and there are many techniques in data science which allow you to really try to get at what should be the shape of your sample, and then see what sample as your training really reflects that. And increasingly, there are technologies that try to even point you in the areas where you're lacking data. And I was in a discussion with the students earlier, I was discussing these concepts of dark knowledge and the fact that you can now use data science using the information that you have to try and actually create a map and point you to of missing knowledge that you can go and try and fill. And we can use some of these technologies. However, it wouldn't be true to say that despite all of the careful things that you might do in your training, that of course there is still a fundamental bias because of what you're collecting. And the key thing with this is to develop these, to ensure that whatever you develop are these ever-learning algorithms, that it is constantly improving and it's constantly learning. It's static with the shape of one data set. Regarding the issue of sort of, again, this conflict between, on the one hand, we want to be really precise. We want to identify vulnerabilities in specific populations. We want to be able to create almost a medical digital avatar of every individual that we can treat perfectly. And that goes against the grain of our civil liberties and everything fought for as democracies to protect the individual. And again, I'd love to hear what the others have to say, but I ultimately you have to have regulation as a key part of the solution. It's and it's really much like any other tool that one might use. And let's not forget how much information we're sharing about ourselves every moment. Even we're to each other on Twitter at the moment, and people know precisely what we're doing at this very moment. You're constantly sharing information, really, really sensitive information about ourselves. And so there is no such regulation to really strong governance on what can be done and what's not allowed to be. It's my opinion.
Yeah, Dr. Sawyers.
So I can speak a little bit to the point you made about sort of fear or lack of trust in being part of a database. So I think it's well known in the existing genomic databases that they're primarily populated by Caucasian and Western European individuals. Part of that is to the technology and some of the points I made in answer to an earlier question. But the distrust, if we can get over the access barrier and make it available, what I've seen work the best for overcoming the distrust is to engage that community, ideally with patient advocates and physicians of the ethnicity of that group, and have it be a partnership from within. Certainly, the sort of Caucasian doctor from Sloan Kettering going to the, far corners of Queens does not work as well as in having a doctor from a hospital based in Queens be a partner in the project. And I'm involved in a project which is doing that right now. It's still early days, but there's a lot of optimism that this approach will help. And I'd love to hear what Chanita thinks about these kinds of.
Well, maybe let's
Sure,
have, and then move back to the broader question of data set quality, perhaps from Dr. Thomas. Go ahead, Dr. Halbert.
Oh, okay. All right. Sure. I would agree with everything that's been said. Now data emerging about the ineffectiveness of language processing or other types of algorithms that are used to refer patients to different types of treatment because they haven't been developed on things that are representative of different groups. And so I think the strategies I described are really important. And just to amplify that a little bit more with an example, one purpose of the minority undersized within the NCI Community Oncology Research Program is that these centers were based on having a racially or geographically diverse patient population, and then having the infrastructure available to use more sensitive approaches for recruiting groups, racial and ethnic minority groups in particular, in trials. And so one initiative is the Early Onset Malignancy Initiative, which is specifically working within the minority sites at an NCORE to acquire samples from racial and minority groups diagnosed with early onset breast, prostate, colon, and a couple other ones are included. And I think a really important approach because it's one, providing the resources to support the sample acquisition such that the patient population, but also at the same time have the infrastructure can be racially conformed. Project where we talk to patients about getting informed consent to provide a biospecimen to this particular initiative and the biorepository. So I would agree and think that those are, and we have empirical data which shows that those approaches do work. So I think those are really important strategies in this echo and support the notion of use those.
Dr. Thomas, I wondered if you had any thoughts on sort of thinking about the AI and the data quality and sort of why it's so important with good information.
So that was directed toward me? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I just have some general comments. I mean, I defer to my colleagues here who are closer to patients than people who work directly with patients. But I think in general, as you look at these types of approaches, what you can see, I think, from some of the talks is that these approaches are enormously powerful because they're unifying different sets of data into these large databases, right? And if you go back and when I started, and some of the other folks here maybe started, everything was very fragmented and very, we actually lost a lot of information, a lot of data. We used to capture everything, of course, in lab notebooks and all these kind of things. We still do a bit of that, but most of this goes directly into databases. So what Bissan was saying, I think was really great, is that you start to collect all this information and you lose it anymore. It becomes a building process, right? And so it's constantly improving. It's being enriched constantly with additional data. And I think that's the age that we're living. We're not going to lose that much information anymore. The challenge is getting the right information together and putting the right tools to those large bodies of data, extract the most knowledge from. And those algorithms are improving as well. So the more that we do, the better we get the information we bring in, the better we'll be in the longer term. That's why I kind of envy this current generation, because I think this current generation, the younger scientists, are going to have access to these tools, and they're going to answer and break open some of the things that we struggled with for many, many years. So I think it's quite promising.
Yeah, Dr. Schmitz.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure that I take a second to reflect on the fact that AI isn't just for genomics and big data. It also is for intervention. And so we're at iLab to do an AI-oriented project that is a supportive care intervention for metastatic cancer patients. And we're actually using the Alexa Echo Show. Oh, no, I said her name. She's going to talk to me in the room. But anyway, we're learning. It's a learning system that helps us to understand whether advising the woman to walk makes her feel better that day when she checks back in, or was it the soothing music intervention that was really helpful? And we're learning what it is that makes sense to provide. Very, very relevant to Suzanne Chambers' work as well.
Question is partially targeted at Dr. Chambers, but also anyone would be welcome to answer it. So think about these increasing sort of sessions and improvisations, like the definition of cancer. So if we think the cancer is being defined by the mutation rather than being defined by the body part. You mentioned that when you looked at support groups, what worked in cancer patients didn't necessarily work for prostate cancer patients. And so what impact do you think that the sort of separate, like label different types of cancer might have on sort of patient experience? How do you think it might impact the sort of support groups that are formed around breast cancer now if you have 5 divisions that are all having different experiences that impact the sort of support group?
So that's a complicated question for me, but I guess the first thing to say would be that individuals, based on their backgrounds first, and the socio-cultural and we exist and how they affect health, what influences that. That's first of all. And then secondly, of course, their diagnosis. What sort of cancer is this? What's their prognosis? What's their treatment experience like? All of that play. So I think we're very much, from a supportive care point of view and a supportive care point of view, looking at things tailored towards that individual's particular situation. I mean, if we talk about just what the patient experience is like as new treatments emerge, I think what I see happening is that there's still this huge difference in access So patients who feel lucky enough to get onto that clinical trial to fit the criteria or to live in the right city where they can get access to it, feel very happy about that. And then patients in support groups potentially who are connected electronically with them, don't live in the same city, but they are missing out. And it's a very dynamic situation that I observe happening as we've got these great innovations in medical treatments, which we want cures, that's for extension of life, but it really is only a restricted access to it. So I've been involved in a study that is a profile, particular type of personalised medicine. These are small random control trials happening in just one major city, Sydney. It's impossible to blind people to this because the standard treatment is chemotherapy, the other radioactive treatment. Patients know about this, think it's a miracle cure. They can only have free access if they're on the trial, otherwise they need to sell a house, and they go into trial. They get told about randomisation and they understand cognitively, but that's not why they're there. They're there to get the new advanced disease that's resistant to treatment, and if they don't get it and they get the standard treatment, which is an excellent course also, then they're dropping out, or they're thinking like this didn't work out the way I wanted to, or they're going off and access it. Now that's nobody's fault. I don't tell this story to say that means someone's doing the wrong thing, but it is a function of what happens as there's rapid emergence of innovative treatments, and we quite rightfully still have them in the trial setting, but we're kind of kidding ourselves, I think. Imagine the patients really understand and accept randomised the way we would hope.
Anyone else add to this? Okay, so the next question, everyone, and it's
I just
essentially
throw in that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just not to sound pessimistic. I just want to throw answer to that on our clinical trials people is to develop a care intervention that goes along with your randomised trial of these people that is tailored to those needs, so that we support them through.
So the next question is for everyone, and essentially it's, where do you see things going in the future? So that could be the year or two future, it could be the 10 years in the future, 15 years in the future, where things headed here. So we talked about this being in the age of biotechnology when we set up the conference, and certainly the age is still very much happening in that it's been developing for many, many years, and the sort of products of this basic science foundation and chemistry knowledge and things like that will be continuing for quite a while. So where's the path? And so for this, let's just go in the order in which talks were presented. Start with Dr. and then go on to Dr. Halbert and go on from there.
So I'm starting first.
Yep. Where do you think cancer treatments go?
So
it's a big question.
Yeah, I couldn't hear. I'm worried that we're going to see more and more disabled. As Suzanne just mentioned, some people are lucky enough to get on a trial because they're close. So at least as far as and Kathryn mentioned, that it's with several time constants. So one is the training of new and old ones. You can't teach old dogs new tricks and so on. And then there's just the fact that to be on these trials, you need to live close to some of these, the elite cancer centers. So I think that's going to be a problem. And I really worry about that. I mean, it's for new to move out and to get where the bodies will go away, I think it's more than a decade. And so that's my concern. I think the sense is moving at a pace never seen before. And we heard what AI today from Bissan. I think all of those things will be implemented, but then diffusing out to where most people get access is, I worry, is going to take a long time.
So I think I'm next. I agree. I mean, I do think there's a lot to, there's a reason to be optimistic. We know a lot more. We can do a lot more, which I think the field is much greater than. But I would also echo the term about there will be further disparities because of access issues, because you're being treated as centers and have sort of this advanced medicine technology, and so I think as we know we're able to use big data more effectively, able to develop therapies that there's complementary care process in which efforts are made to implement sort of what makes something diverse clinical setting. That it doesn't, if you have to travel to an lab to an NCI designated or to access to that particular therapy. I do think and I'm optimistic about that because that is part of the, at least the collective thought process. In particular, the National Cancer Institute has been their community oncology research program. One of the focal areas is on cancer research, which is really has a focus on dissemination and science. So I'm hopeful, and I think over the next 2 years we'll see more dissemination being conducted and what needs to happen, how care delivered at a system level and at a patient level, and I think that will happen. I know that is happening of those types of studies. So I think that's where the field is going over the next 2 or 3 years.
Thomas.
I'll give it a shot here. Yes, I see a very hopeful future. Right, that trends in the right direction in terms of our understanding of biology in general, and as we've talked about today, the tools that we have are much more powerful. So I think it will accelerate, and I think we're getting better at learning on the ground. So I think there's a number of things that we do need to do, and we definitely need to get much better prediction very early in discovery. And we need to move very fast. So the clinic talked about some of these things and segment the patient populations. And I think some of these tools that we've been talking about will certainly help do that. Seeing the patterns in that patients. And that'll accelerate the discovery process and the development process. So there are literally, there are thousands of molecules in the clinic now. In clinical, and I had a person that was mine a few years ago. He MD PhD, a lot smarter than I was. He said, it's really important that we move these drugs into the clinic because every time that we move into a patient, we learn. Right? We're getting additional data, and that will continue to accelerate our learning. So You know, the biology is so enormously complex, it's still hard to predict, but we're getting better at prediction. But the more medicine, the more drugs we get into, the more efficiently we learn from that, the faster this will all. So I think hopeful at a high level. It's complex, very complex, but I'm hopeful that some of these changes, the complexity of cancer itself, thousands really under one category, one term. It's been daunting, but I'm very hopeful that there'll be some in the not too distant future. But I said that several years ago.
Dr. Chambers.
I'll make a comment, which would just be that I'm hopeful that we really will start taking a broader, more holistic view about what influences patient outcomes and what we would do. And in reference to Kathryn, what I would say that many of those oncology colleagues in Australia, the effects, very real clinical effects that you can get for exercise medicine, cancer patients, if it's properly applied. If you could patent it or sell it, you'd make a fortune, yet it remains often the exception rather than the rule. So if we could just, you know, and it mystifies me, may I say, Kathryn, about why it hasn't happened. So but I'm hopeful, and again, all of our clinical colleagues to be open to considering the broader picture with the patients and the spaces that we have, both like exercise medicine in particular, and of course psycho-oncology.
Okay, so you've asked the question that I have decided the rest of my career on, and that is translation of exercise into the standard of care in oncology practice. So thank you for asking such a great question. I actually have founded an initiative through the American College of Sports Medicine called Moving Through Cancer, which has its mission to do exactly this. And our goal is for exercise to be standard of care in medical oncology, clinical oncology in general, by 2029. And we have a 5-point plan, if you will. And so probably the most important part of that plan is that of awareness, empowerment, and engagement. So I like to tell a story, and I'll try to be very brief here, that there's a time when we used to keep people in bed a long time after a heart attack. In fact, Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack while he was sitting president. And he was kept in bed for 3 weeks. And Dwight, his cardiologist at what is now Walter Reed, was sharply criticizing the president out of bed so soon. So, you know, really changed, obviously. Why did they change? They changed because of science, but they also changed because of advocacy on the part of major organizations like the College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association, American College of Sports Medicine. So we need similar types of awareness, because the average person on the street, pretty much anywhere in the world, in the westernized nations, if you walk up and ask them, you know, is exercise good for someone's heart? They'll say yes. But if you ask them if someone receiving cancer treatment should be physically active, they are likely to say, no, they should rest. They should rest. And there's a reason for that, because we were talking about the education of clinicians before. And, you know, medicine is taught in very much an apprenticeship style. And here are clinicians, and in clinical oncology setting, saying rest, take it, don't push yourself, but the junior clinicians learn to say. So we have a lot of workforce education to do with oncology clinicians, but also, frankly, with fitness professionals as well. The vast majority of fitness professionals today do not have anything in how to work with the oncology population. So we have to fix that as well. We need to develop more programming. Live Strong at the Y is a lovely program. It's not perfect, and it is not for everybody. So we need a lot of other kinds of programs. We need them to be virtual. We need them to be one-on-one. We need them to be group. We need them to be, you know, meet the behavioral needs of people living with and beyond cancer. We certainly need more research. We need more evaluation. I think we need a huge amount of cancer-free research, as Chanita had mentioned before. We need to implement science. We need precision oncology. I think if we were to have, one of my colleagues in exercise oncology is at Memorial Sloan Kettering and brilliant oncology. If he discovers that we improve treatment outcome in breast cancer as a result of his interventions, it's going to potentiate, all change in this area faster than anything can do. But finally, there's policy. What we're doing there is, for your own edification, organizations across the United States, I'm sure there are similar organizations in the UK and Australia, that govern our cancer centers. And this is not just the National Institutes of Health designated cancer. So for breast cancer, there's a national accreditation program for breast centers. An exercise standard has been proposed to NAPBC. What is meant by that is if a breast center is accredited NAPBC, they must meet the standards of NAPBC. They must meet them. And if the standards say you must talk about exercise, that is going to change clinical practice as much as anything else. So we need to change the policies at NAPBC, but also at something called the American College of Surgeons Commission on Cancer. An example of this kind of policy change that changed clinical practice occurred back in the 90s when a brilliant psycho-oncologist referred to by Dr. Chambers in her talk, Jimmy Holland, discovered that patients do much worse if they have a great deal of stress, and convinced the American College of Surgeons Commission on Cancer that we need screening for psychosocial distress during clinical care. That now happens with great regularity because policy of the ACOS-COC, because it is required by policy. And so I think that we are very definitely going to have as a standard of care. The tipping point is now. It is going to happen in the next decade, or bust.
And Dr. Sawyers, where is it going next?
We've covered a lot already, and of course I agree with that. But maybe I'll touch on what Jim brought up about the amount of new scientific knowledge, molecular biology, chemistry, et cetera, level. So one of the things I'm incredibly excited about is the ability to now develop drugs against some of the cancer driver proteins that were always thought to be in a subclass that was called the evil genome. One technology that I think if I was a college student today that I'd pay a lot of attention to is this concept of chemical degradation of proteins. So these are small molecules attached to a protein. Instead of that protein having to have an active site and be an enzyme and inhibit the enzyme, if it can with certain chemicals to make the protein be degraded by the cell, and that has already been shown to be. The thing that I perhaps worry the most about is the problem that we've faced with all drugs, back to infectious diseases and antibiotics and so forth, and that is the problem of acquired resistance. It can be addressed with rational combinations of drugs, but each one is its own puzzle to solve, and it takes time. But I think the knowledge bases that we have and the power of AI will help us get there faster. So that's my crystal.
Yeah, as someone at the intersection of biology and chemistry, that drug resistance problem is something that I find particularly fascinating and problematic all at the same time. How about Dr. Al-Lazikani? Where do you think we're going in the future?
Well, it's very difficult to follow, such beautiful, insightful, and diverse views. But thinking about the issue, I'm thinking a little bit further away. So whether we're addressing the issues of drug resistance and the fact that actually the tumors and the cancer, it's not that you develop drug resistance once or twice, constantly changing and it's constantly moving. So we have to have some way of monitoring and addressing that. I've spoken a little bit in my talk about the importance of early diagnosis. This is something that we've not really touched upon too much in the discussion. But our best way to treat the patients is just not to let them develop advanced disease in the first place, because then we know we're going to do a really good job. The accessibility will become less of an issue, etc. And so for me, I see a future where we really think about the democratization of accessibility to information, tools that allows the patient to identify when something's wrong and seek help before it got too long, far along. The existence of these super centers of excellence will always be necessary, because that's where you can bring in the mass, the sort of the critical mass and the sort of brain power and resources in order to do really innovative things. So we must never sort of think that to do away with those. What we need to think about is how do we streamline the delivery of the capabilities from those to everywhere else. And I really think technology is a really key part of doing that. So we have to think about where we want to be in 10, 15 years' time in terms of providing the access to the patients of the knowledge of the tests, what logistics we need to put together in order to deliver the tests and deliver the results rapidly to all the areas that need them. And think about the therapies that we're delivering in that context, that one day we have to make sure they fit into these logistics to make sure that they rapidly reach everyone else. And I see a future where actually all of that will become a lot easier, a lot more accessible for everybody.
Well, thank you. So let's end on that little note of optimism, of at least a possibility where we can start to address these incredible challenges, access and equity, along with the sort of promise of the new developments and things like that. So I want to thank each and every one of you for being a part of this discussion, being a part through your talks, podcasts, through everything. We were very, very sad that you weren't able to join us here, but we did the best, and I really, really appreciate everyone's contributions and everyone's voice. Incredibly important conversation.
And I would add my thanks. And also apologies that the internet is not entirely cooperating with us this afternoon, but I'm reminded that when we have to struggle to comprehend, the learning that we do sticks better. So I think we will all remember what we've just talked about here, because we had to work a little bit harder to do it. Thank you so very much to all of you. And you are welcome at Gustavus anytime that it's safe for you to come. And I hope you do. Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. I wanted to, while we are waiting for Dwight Stoll to join me to just make some final remarks, I wanted to remind everyone that the Nobel Conference is made possible by some really generous contributions. The core endowment funding for the Nobel Conference endowment was permanently secured through the generosity of the late Adeline and the Reverend Drell Bernardson. Thank you to that family for that gift. It also is supported by major legacy gifts. It also includes gifts from the Russell and Rhoda Lund Foundation, the Mardag Foundation in memory of Edgar Ober, and the United Health Group. This year's Nobel concert was underwritten by a gift from Ted and Dawn Michael. And I just remind you that generous gifts from colleagues and friends of Megan Berglund made possible the first lecture of this year. So with that, I am curious to hear what my colleague Dwight Stoll has to say. This was a dream for 5 or so years, and now Dwight has just experienced the dream made real. So Dwight, what are your thoughts at this point as we draw the curtain on Nobel 2020? What does it look like compared to what you thought it might look like?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I mean, I think as I've participated in several of these conferences now and thinking through the kinds of things we hope to achieve with this particular conference, I think we definitely achieved a couple of our goals. One is that which you called out earlier today, I think in your opening remarks this morning, just reflecting or observing what Jim Thomas said yesterday, that, hey, like, I didn't even know your field existed. It's great that we could have this conversation and, increase our respective awareness of what each other are doing. So that to me is always, I would say that happens probably every year that I observe Nobel Conference in some way, shape, or form. And so I'm, on the one hand, not surprised to see it happen again, but very happy about it. I think it's one of the really great things about this conference format. And I think the other thing I would say in terms of, thinking back to, 2 years or so ago when we were very much in brainstorming mode for the conference, and we sat in rooms together with Post-it notes and mind maps taped to the wall, and thought about the kinds of things we'd like to achieve. One of the things we really emphasize is really talking about the impact of cancer on the whole person. And I think that while I think the way that we drew it up and organized the talks and things had an influence on that, I think it also just kind of came out organically. So that was really, really nice to see it borne out that way. The third thing I would say, and this just kind of occurred to me today, is I think in conferences, certainly conferences that I attend, they tend to be very specialized. And sometimes speakers will say things like, well, so-and-so has done this work and you should go look at their paper, look at their work, and so on. And what's really great, again, about this format is it's not go look at their paper, it's, well, you're sitting next to me virtually now, but they're right here. We should just ask them. Or, they're going to talk about this in 30 minutes, or they talked about it yesterday. So it just makes it really takes away that barrier, that sort of disciplinary barrier that we see sometimes, and makes the learning, I think, much more immediate, because we can access that expertise right away. The last thing I want to say in sort of my opening remarks here, I guess, is that is getting at the basic science piece. So this came up a few times today, and one of the quotes, I guess it was a title of Dr. Sawyers on one of his slides. It said, "Cancer is becoming more treatable because we understand what causes it." And while that might seem sort of obvious, it reminds me of a similar quote from a friend of mine in the pharmaceutical industry who's in the R&D business, who says you can't control what you don't understand. So when he says that, it's more about manufacturing drugs in a safe way. And what he means is if you don't understand your process really, really well, then you're limited in terms of how you can control it to produce a safe product. But it really applies here. And the two, I think the idea that ties those things together is the sort of notion of basic research, that we don't know what we're going to need in the future in terms of knowledge and tools. And of course, we have to make reasonable decisions about the kinds of things we work on now, but it's really points to the value of what we call basic research, that it's hard to predict when we're going to need that tool, need that knowledge, and that it has a lot of value because of that. Because if we understand those details better now, eventually in the future we'll be able to use them. And sort of related to that, I think, Lisa, you said at some point in the basic science conversation earlier today something like, well, how do we communicate to people the value of it? And one of the things I would say is it's really hard to measure, because the value is invisible sometimes, I think. Maybe a metaphor is like if I own a hardware store, if there's a checkout at the front of the store and somebody goes in to buy a tool and they have to pay for it on the way out, it's really obvious. I needed the tool, I paid for it, here's how I'm going to use it. With science, to some extent, it is in a way a hardware store that doesn't have a checkout counter, right? We, as individual scientists, we try to disseminate and publish the things that we learn. And once it's in the public domain, there's nobody at the counter to know when somebody has come into the store and picked up a tool. And that's really great on the one hand, right? That's how we as scientists, I think, feel it should work. It's part of why we do what we do. And yet the flip side of that is it's kind of hard to measure the impact of that work, right? Because nobody's at the counter taking the money, so to speak. Yeah, so those are kind of some things that I grabbed reflecting on today.
And with respect to that last point, I also think about, I'm always sort of astonished that nature bothered to invent so many beetles, many kinds of beetles, and you think, surely we don't need all those kinds of beetles. And yes, I understand that's the wrong way to think about biology, but in a similar way, it feels like, well, why would we need to do all these different things? And indeed, research should be abundant precisely because we cannot make any kinds of predictions about what sorts of things will work. I mean, when Scott mentioned, well, look, we need art in certain kinds of ways in order to portray the structure of complex proteins. And my goodness, that slide from Bissan Al-Lazikani that showed one of those proteins, suddenly, Dwight, the difference between a small molecule and a large molecule was made abundantly clear for me in a way that it really had not been up until that moment. So it's challenging for us. I mean, I remember one time having a conversation with my parents and my mother. We were watching robotics trials on television, of all things. My mother said, why are they bothering to teach robots how to, move something from point A to point B? And my dad and I said, well, there's, of course, the possibility of, robotics being used to, rescue people from burning buildings. Or we sort of launched into a whole list of ways in which this seemingly ridiculous college exercise was, in fact, not at all ridiculous. So, yeah. What are some of the surprises for you in this conference? Were there pieces of insight that struck you, or interchanges between two people that made you think, oh, that's unusual? It seems like every conference there's a moment when you say, wow, I did not see that coming. Were there any of those sorts of moments for you?
Yeah, I think several. On the topic of access, I mean, I think we, those that were involved in planning the conference certainly, prioritize that in the program and try to engage speakers that could speak to that. But just a lot of the detail that flowed out of that was new to me, and I think really eye-opening. The impact of one of the threads that I felt was there was sort of the impact of stress that cancer patients experience, and how profound the impact of that is on how they respond to treatment and how they experience the disease. I mean, a lot is known about the impact of stress on physiology, but to really hear that brought up multiple times and talked about in a lot of detail was really kind of striking for me. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to escape the harsh reality, I guess, of, there was quite a few comments over the course of the 2 days just about things like, yeah, with COVID now, telehealth is a really important thing, but in fact, our infrastructure is not so great. And even if we have the concept of telehealth and people ready to do it, we don't necessarily have the infrastructure to really support that in a robust and equitable way. So for me, it's sort of has shown a light on some of the dark corners there and places we need to work. I guess more on the science aspects that are maybe a little closer to me. One thing that's been kind of taking me by surprise, I would say, even before this conference, but again is really amplified here, is just I've been telling my colleagues in my research area things like AI and machine learning, like the train has left the station. And if you're not on it, you're going to know soon. And, I think, again, really, that was clear to me through these talks again. And for those of us, myself included, for which machine learning was not part of what I learned in school, so to speak, we have a lot of learning to do to catch up and to really figure out where that can have an impact on our work and how we structure these things going forward. I would also say that it's really interesting, the notion of public databases and how we use all this information going forward, sort of what's behind paywalls, what's public, and what are the strategies that we use there. That's, to me, a very a rich area to think about, and I think is a lot is going to be made of that conversation about that going forward. So yeah, those are some of the sort of aha things for me.
Great, thanks. Are there questions that still remain from what our audience was wondering about that you think this one should be explored before we leave? I know we covered quite a few of them along the way. Did any of those rise up for you that you think, that's something that would be really nice for us to have just a moment to talk about before we close the book? Sorry if that puts you on the spot.
Yeah. Nothing really jumps out. I think we hit on some of the high points, some really good questions that people would naturally have. I mean, that's another impression I had is just, wow, pretty amazing the sort of intellectual territory we covered in the last 2 days. It's incredibly broad, and because the territory is so broad, it's really hard to. It's challenging for the speakers to decide what to talk about in 40 minutes or so. So some of the details naturally go uncovered. And I think some of the things that I saw in the audience questions that people would reasonably have after a talk like that, some of the more important things I think were addressed in your sessions with our faculty hosts and also in the panel discussion. So I think for me, there's not anything sort of burning, standing out at the moment. Yeah.
Okay. And just an observation that, there is a real trade-off in choosing to make a conference that's broader, and that, again, is always that exploration between science and ethics. And, it would have been very easy to do an entire conference about the drugs alone and about the possibilities and the promise of them. And in choosing not to do so, yes, obviously, there's a real loss, even as there's also a gain. So what would you like our audience, last question, you get to have a softball. What would you like our audience to take away from today or from these last 2 days?
I think just the complexity of the situation, the extent to which the different fields that the speakers have spoken about really can support each other and learn from one another, and thinking about how what are the ways that we as citizens too can participate in breaking through some of those difficult things. So in the panel this afternoon, sort of the role of the patient. The role of the clinician was discussed, and how can they, learn about these new things and how are those implemented, but also what is the role of the patient in that. And of course, I spoke about the basic science piece, and I can't let this moment go by, I guess, without saying that anytime we as citizens have the opportunity to really advocate for support for basic science is really important, because we as scientists and investigators, we obviously think our work is important and really advocate for that. But at least in the United States, a lot of that work is taxpayer funded. And so we appreciate that support, but also, are continuously advocating for the value of that work and the importance of having the public on board to keep supporting that work going forward.
Great. Well, thanks again, Dr. Dwight Stoll, Department of Chemistry at Gustavus, to you and Dr. Laura Burek of Biology for the incredible work that you have both done, and you and the committee, to make this amazing conference happen. So thanks very much. It's been a real pleasure.
All right. Likewise, Lisa. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye. And so at that point, we are at the end of Nobel Conference 56. And as we turn the page, the last talk could not have been more forward-looking, because next year's conference is Big Data Revolution. And I need to figure out how to say the revolution, because it's sort of rev or evolution. So the topic: how is big data changing our lives, and what challenges and opportunities